Chapter 1. A Most Curious Discovery. It was a day much like any other in the village of Fernwood Hollow, bright, breezy, and touched with the faintest scent of apples ripening in the orchards beyond the churchyard wall. The villagers moved at their usual unhurried pace, exchanging pleasantries over white picket fences and lingering a little longer than necessary at the market stalls under the excuse of comparing Mrs. Bancroft's new preserves to last season's Miss Marple visiting. Her friend Mrs. Weatherby had intended no more than a brief, pleasant afternoon of tea and gossip. She had just been remarking upon the remarkable health of Mrs. Weatherby's chrysanthemums when the doorbell rang with unusual urgency. Mrs. Weatherby, flustered, shuffled off to answer it. From the hall came a flurry of voices, one shrill and agitated, the other firm but low. When Mrs. Weatherby returned, she was accompanied by young Emily Carter, the vicar's niece, her cheeks flushed and her hands trembling around the brim of her straw hat. "Oh, Miss Marple!" Emily cried the moment she caught sight of her. "You must come at once. It's something dreadful." Miss Marple rose at once, smoothing her skirt. "My dear, what is it?" Emily wrung her hands. "It's at the church, at St. Winifred's, in the old vestry. I was setting up for the charity jumble tomorrow when I found it." She stopped, visibly shivering. "A wax figure, a doll, but it's been defiled." Mrs. Weatherby gasped, clutching her chest. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "A doll, you say?" Emily nodded frantically. "And it's dressed like the vicar's wife, in miniature, right down to her Sunday hat, and someone stuck pins, horrible pins, into it." There was a stunned silence. Then Miss Marple, in her gentle, decisive way, took Emily by the elbow. "Come along, dear. Best we have a look." The small procession made its way across the village green, drawing curious glances. News travelled faster than any vehicle in Fernwood Hollow. By the time they reached St. Winifred's, a handful of villagers had begun to trail discreetly behind. Inside, the church was cool and dim, the heavy scent of lilies lingering from last week's harvest. Service. Emily led the way down the narrow side aisle to the vestry, her steps faltering at the threshold. "There," she whispered, pointing. Miss Marple entered first. The vestry was much as she remembered it, a plain stone-flagged room with high dust-laden windows and the faint smell of old hymnals and brass polish. But in the centre of the battered oak table lay an object so incongruous, so macabre, that for a moment even Miss Marple hesitated. It was a wax doll, about 18 inches tall, crudely shaped but unmistakably dressed in miniature replica clothes, a navy skirt, a white blouse with tiny mother-of-pearl buttons, and a ridiculous feathered hat perched precariously atop moulded yellow hair. Most horribly, the doll was riddled with long rusted pins, one through the heart, another through the left eye, and others embedded cruelly into its limbs. A gasp rose from the doorway. Mrs. Weatherby clutched at Emily's sleeve. "That's Mrs. Littleton's Sunday best, it is," she cried. "Why, I'd know that dreadful hat anywhere." Miss Marple moved closer, careful not to touch the doll. There was something unsettlingly intimate about the figure, the detail in the stitching, the deliberate positioning, and the cruelty of the pins. She turned to Emily. "Was the room locked when you arrived?" Emily shook her head. "The vicar said to leave it open for the jumble sale preparations. Anyone could have come in." "And you touched nothing?" "Only the door. I swear it. Miss Marple nodded, satisfied. She studied the surrounding room. No sign of forced entry, no overturned chairs, only the faint scuff marks of shoes across the stone floor. Perhaps Emily's, perhaps someone else's. Miss Marple bent closer to the table. Something glinted beneath the hem of the doll's skirt. With a gloved hand, she carefully extracted it. A gold cufflink, tiny, etched with the initials HP. She slipped it into her reticule without comment. By noon, the entire village was abuzz. Mrs. Littleton, the vicar's wife herself, was found sitting rigidly in the vicarage drawing-room, her face drained of colour. She insisted she felt fine. Ehudith, silly business, that's all. But more than one observant soul noticed her trembling hands and the way her eyes darted toward the window at the slightest sound. Rumours bloomed like dandelions. Witchcraft, said some, voodoo, said others, though few knew exactly what it entailed. More practical villagers muttered about revenge or malice, perhaps over the vicar's recent decision to ban certain families from burial plots on the sunny side of the churchyard. Mrs. Weatherby, who prided herself on knowing everything worth knowing, was certain it was all connected to the rivalry between the Women's Institute and the Church Flower Committee. Miss Marple, however, said nothing. She had seen the small scratch marks near the table leg. She had noted the peculiar scent lingering near the doll. Not church polish, but beeswax mixed with something sharper, more pungent. And she had recognized the cufflink. Not many men in Fernwood Hollow had monogrammed cufflinks, and only one of them had the initials HEP. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her small sitting room at the Rose Cottage, her knitting untouched in her lap. She thought about Mrs. Littleton's face, about the cufflink, about the long-forgotten quarrels that so often festered in quiet places. And she thought, too, about the wax doll, about what it symbolized, a warning, a threat, or something even darker. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the fallen leaves into restless eddies. Inside, Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, steadily, as it always did. There was a secret hidden in the shadows of Fernwood Hollow. A secret someone was willing to reveal, through cruelty, and perhaps, if necessary, through something even worse. Miss Marple picked up her knitting and resumed her work. There would be time enough tomorrow to begin untangling the threads. After all, one could not rush a pattern, especially when that pattern might end in death. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. By the next morning, Fernwood Hollow was in a state of high excitement, rarely seen outside of the annual Maypole celebrations, or the regrettable incident with Mrs. Trumble's runaway pig. The discovery of the wax doll had spread through the village like a fire through dry thatch, and with each retelling, the story grew more outrageous. At the post office, Mrs. Sims leaned over the counter, whispering urgently to Mr. Jenkins, the blacksmith. They say it's witchcraft, real old-world witchcraft, just like in the stories. Someone's put a curse on the vicar's wife. Mr. Jenkins, who prided himself on his rational mind, snorted. Rubbish, Sarah. More likely some young fool with nothing better to do. Still, he shuffled uneasily as he collected his newspaper. At the village bakery, Mrs. Danvers added her own spin while dispensing hot cross buns. My cousin, who lived in Sussex, knew a woman who died after someone put a wax doll under her bed," she said, her voice a thrilling half-whisper. "Dead within a month she was. Turned green." "Green?" gasped Mrs. Weatherby, almost dropping her bun. "Right as rain one day, green the next." Miss Marple, who had paused to select a seed cake, allowed herself a faint smile. She had learned long ago that villagers, when faced with a mystery, seldom sought logical explanations first. Fear was faster and far more colourful. At the Rose and Crown, where men gathered under the pretence of discussing the weather, the theories were no more sensible. "I tell you," said old Mr. Fenimore, tapping his pipe against the hearth, "it's that new family, the Cartwrights. Come from London, they did. All sorts in London, you know." "Too many books, that lot," grumbled Mr. Pierce. "Witchcraft, magic, secret societies, mark my words." "Or it's that girl Emily," added Mr. Bolton, wagging a gnarled finger. "Well, found it, didn't she? People who find things are often the ones who put 'em there." The others grunted agreement, though none had ever known Emily Carter to exhibit anything more sinister than a fondness for blackberry picking. Meanwhile, Mrs. Littleton remained confined to the vicarage, ostensibly under Dr. Masterson's orders for rest and no excitement. But Miss Marple, having tea with the doctor's wife, learned otherwise. "She's frightened," Mrs. Masterson confided, stirring her cup with brisk, economical movements. "Won't admit it, of course, but she hardly eats, hardly sleeps." Miss Marple nodded. "Frightened of whom, I wonder?" Mrs. Masterson shrugged. "Everyone, I think. When you've lived in a place as long as the Littletons have, you know all the old quarrels, all the little grudges." She sighed. "Poor woman. She looks over her shoulder at every footstep." Miss Marple set down her cup, her expression serene. She was beginning to see the outlines of something more than mischief, something personal, targeted, deliberate. That afternoon Miss Marple visited the church once more. The vestry had been locked since the discovery, but the air of unease remained thick in the building. She moved quietly along the side aisle, pausing to examine the notice board. There, pinned among the announcements of choir practice and flower roster duties, was a new flyer, Fernwood Hollow Village Charity, fate postponed until further notice. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the notice. Fear, she thought again. Fear was faster than reason, faster than compassion. It spread, undermined, corroded. The fate was only the beginning. If the village turned fully against itself, no one would be safe from suspicion. No one would be spared the consequences. That evening, seated comfortably in Mrs. Weatherby's parlour, Miss Marple listened quietly as the conversation swirled. "I still say it's that Cartwright boy," declared Mrs. Weatherby. "Always has his nose in books about ghosts." "Or that Mrs. Lane," offered Mr. Weatherby. "She's never liked the vicar's wife. Remember the fuss over the rose garden?" "She did lose the Best Blooms Cup 3 years running," Mrs. Weatherby agreed darkly. Miss Marple smiled and said nothing. She had always found it fascinating how quickly old wounds resurfaced when stirred, like silt at the bottom of a pond. Later that night, Miss Marple sat by her bedroom window, watching the mist creep low over the village rooftops. She turned the facts over in her mind, one by one. The wax doll, cruelly pinned, the miniature replica clothing, painstakingly accurate, the cufflink, marked HP, hidden under the table. The targeted nature of the attack, not random mischief, but a pointed message to Mrs. Littleton. The villagers' reactions, each theory an effort, conscious or not, to deflect fear onto outsiders, newcomers, the other. Miss Marple tapped a finger thoughtfully against her teacup. There was, she knew, no room for outsiders here. This was a village crime. Personal, vicious, and born, as so many crimes were, from long memories and festering resentments. She thought again of the cufflink. H.P. in Fernwood Hollow, that could only mean Harold Pritchard, the church verger. A quiet, self-effacing man, not someone anyone would suspect, which made him all the more interesting. Outside, the church bells tolled softly across the misty fields, their sound muffled by the heavy air. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Tomorrow would be soon enough to set the first small traps. To ask the seemingly innocent questions. To watch the way faces changed, and voices cracked, and eyes darted away. The truth was already there, woven into the fabric of Fernwood Hollow's quiet lanes and tidy gardens. All it needed was a patient hand to tease it free. And Miss Marple, as ever, was very, very patient. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. The sun rose pale and thin over Fernwood Hollow the next morning, casting a watery light over the green fields and narrow lanes. Mist still clung stubbornly in the hollows, lending the village an almost ghostly appearance. Ah, fitting, Miss Marple thought, for a place so steeped in whispered fear. She breakfasted lightly on toast and marmalade, then wrapped herself warmly in her thickest shawl. Today would not be a day of confrontation. Not yet. Today would be for quiet observation, polite questions, and knitting together the tiny frayed threads of human behaviour that others missed. Her first stop was the church. The vestry door was locked, a notice pinned to it reading, "Due to recent disturbances, the vestry is closed until further notice. Please direct all inquiries to the vicarage." Miss Marple smiled faintly. A sensible move, and also, unintentionally, a test. Who would still find reason to linger near the scene of the crime? She didn't have to wait long. As she circled the church garden, pretending to admire the late-blooming dahlias, she spotted Harold Pritchard, the verger, fussing around the side door. He was a small man with thinning hair and a nervous habit of smoothing his waistcoat whenever he spoke. Miss Marple approached casually. "Good morning, Mr. Pritchard," she said warmly. He jumped, nearly dropping his ring of keys. "Miss Marple, didn't see you there. Just checking the locks." "Of course, dear man," she said soothingly. "We must all be careful these days." Bobbed his head. "Nasty business," he muttered. "Nasty. Never thought I'd see the like of it in Fernwood Hollow." "Nor I," Miss Marple agreed, watching him closely. "Especially something so personal." He flinched just slightly. "Personal? Why?" "Yes," she said mildly. "A doll dressed exactly like poor Mrs. Littleton. It seems almost vindictive, don't you think?" Harold's hand rose involuntarily to his collar, loosening it. Suppose someone had a grudge," he said. Some folks hold on to things. Old slights. Indeed they do, Miss Marple said softly. He offered a strained smile and hurried off, mumbling about checking the bell tower. Miss Marple watched him go, the image of the cufflink marked HP flashing once more through her mind. Next, she strolled to the village shop. Mrs. Sims, eager for an audience, bustled around the counter while dispensing eggs and gossip in equal measure. "Mark my words, Miss Marple," she said, lowering her voice dramatically. "It's that foreign girl, the one the Cartwrights hired." Miss Marple selected a packet of tea. "I didn't know they'd hired someone," she said innocently. Mrs. Sims nodded fiercely. "Spanish or Italian, something like that, always looking sideways at folk and muttering." "It's alarming," Miss Marple said kindly. She knew, of course, that the so-called foreign girl was Maria Lopez, a bright, shy young woman from Madrid, newly arrived to help Mrs. Cartwright with her newborn twins. Miss Marple had met her briefly. Polite, soft-spoken, homesick. A target for easy suspicion, and therefore almost certainly innocent. Mrs. Sims leaned closer. "And the wax, Miss Marple. You know what they say, the old magic from the continent. Dolls and spells and such." Miss Marple smiled benignly, paid for her tea, and left. Superstition was often the village's first refuge, but the truth, she thought, usually hid behind the ordinary, not the exotic. Outside, she paused to watch Emily, Carter lugging a basket of hymn books toward the church. The girl still looked pale and flustered from the shock of her discovery. Miss Marple stepped forward to help. "My dear," she said, as they rearranged the books, "have you remembered anything else? Anyone you saw near the vestry?" Emily bit her lip. "Well, there was someone. I didn't think much of it at the time." "Who?" "Mr. Pritchard," she said hesitantly. "He was by the side door. I thought he was just airing out the vestry." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions hardening. "And did he seem flustered?" Emily frowned. "No, flustered exactly, but hurried, as if he didn't want to be seen." Miss Marple thanked her warmly and left her to her duties. Each small piece slid into place. Her last stop was the vicarage. The Reverend Greenway greeted her wearily. The lines around his eyes deeper than before. "She's resting," he said when Miss Marple inquired after Mrs. Littleton. "The doctor insists on complete calm." Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and allowed the conversation to wander before steering it gently. "Tell me, Reverend," she said casually, "did Harold Pritchard and your wife get along?" The vicar looked surprised. "Of course, Harold's been devoted to the church for years. And to your wife?" He hesitated. She may have been a little sharp with him from time to time. But Harold never minded. He's a sensitive man, easily flustered. And very proud of his duties. Immensely. I think he sees the church almost as his own." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "A man with a strong emotional tie to the church. A man humiliated perhaps by Mrs. Littleton's sharp criticisms. Criticisms that, knowing Mrs. Littleton, were likely harsh and public. A man capable of resentment and subtle cruelty." As she walked home through the misty lanes, Miss Marple reviewed her deductions. The villagers had chased ghosts and foreigners. But the truth, as always, lay at home. The wax doll had been an act of spite, not sorcery. The clothing copied in meticulous detail, the pins a symbol of anger, not magic. The cufflink dropped in haste by the very man who had orchestrated the entire dreadful scene. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided, would be the day she allowed the truth to step into the light, with one small nudge, and perhaps one carefully laid question. Because secrets like wax figures could only withstand so much pressure before they broke. And break they would. Chapter 4. First Suspects. Inspector Graves arrived in Fernwood Hollow the next morning, summoned from Milchester when the village constable, young Officer Perry, deemed the affair above his training. Graves was a large man with a moustache like a walrus, and a manner of speaking that suggested he believed most mysteries could be solved by the application of sheer volume. He set up a makeshift command centre at the Rose and Crown's back room, commandeered the vicar's study by noon, and by tea-time had already announced that he had a good idea who was behind all this foolishness. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner of the Rose and Crown parlour with her knitting, listened carefully to the rumbling pronouncements. Clear as day, Graves was saying to a cluster of eager listeners. Some outsider trying to stir up trouble, always the way. Mark me, it's that foreign girl, Maria Lopez. A ripple of agreement, or at least relief, passed through the gathered villagers. Of course, a stranger, a convenient scapegoat. Mrs. Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap. Maria Lopez, summoned nervously to the vicarage for questioning, stood stiffly before the inspector, her wide dark eyes filled with confusion and growing fear. "You were seen loitering near the church," Graves barked. Maria shook her head rapidly. "I go to church every day. I pray," Graves harumphed. "Praying, were you? Or planting little dolls with pins in 'em?" Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "Inspector," she said mildly, "might I ask a question?" Graves frowned at the interruption, but grudgingly nodded. Miss Marple turned to Maria. "My dear," she said gently, "when you pray, where do you kneel?" Maria blinked. "At the little chapel behind the church, where the lady window is. I light a candle." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "And you go in through the side gate?" "Si, madam, always." Miss Marple turned to Graves. "There is no view from the Lady Chapel to the vestry entrance," she said. Maria could hardly have seen or been seen placing anything inside. Graves bristled, but Mrs. Weatherby chimed in from the crowd. "She's right, Inspector. That window's around the back." Graves grunted. Maybe she had an accomplice. Miss Marple said nothing more. She knew better than to argue. Instead, she simply waited, as she always did. Later, in the tea-room, the villagers buzzed like bees in a hive. Maria's name was on everyone's lips, though the edge of certainty had been dulled slightly by Miss Marple's quiet intervention. Mrs. Sims, still clinging to the foreigner theory, offered dramatic tales of Spanish witchcraft. Mrs. Danvers suggested the Cartwright twins had been cursed as well, citing their recent colds as evidence. Mr. Pierce darkly declared that these outsiders should keep their ways to themselves. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. This was it, not anger, she thought. It was fear. Fear looking for an easy outlet. Blaming Maria was comfortable. Blaming one's own neighbours was much harder. That afternoon, under the pretence of inspecting hymnals, Miss Marple visited the church again. She moved slowly, carefully, noting the small things others missed. A faint scuff on the stone near the vestry door, the kind made by a man's heavier boot, not a woman's dainty heel. A strand of grey wool snagged on a splintered pew, matching the heavy homespun jacket Harold Pritchard favoured. And on the vestry floor, in a narrow crack between stones, she found something else, a second cufflink. Twin, to the first marked again, with H.P. Miss Marple smiled slightly. Harold had been foolish enough to return, it seemed, perhaps to recover something he thought he had left behind. And in doing so, he had left even more evidence. That evening, as the last of the autumn light faded over the fields, Miss Marple sat in the Rose Cottage drawing-room, her knitting set aside. It was time to lay the groundwork for the final stage. Tomorrow would be Sunday. Church service would bring the entire village together. And in a place built for confession, truth would have its moment. But tonight, Miss Marple wrote a short, careful note, addressed to Harold Pritchard, left where he would surely find it. Dear Mr. Pritchard, I believe you may have dropped something important in the vestry. If you would like to discuss it quietly, please come to the Rose Cottage before service tomorrow. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple. She folded it neatly and slipped it under the door of the verger's cottage on her way home. The trap was set. The mist thickened overnight, muffling the village's edges. Miss Marple rose early, dressed with care, and waited by her little parlour window. Sure enough, just after 8, a furtive figure appeared on the lane, head down, shoulders hunched against the cold. Harold Pritchard. He hesitated at the gate, then gathered himself and knocked. Miss Marple opened the door with a welcoming smile. "Do come in, Mr. Pritchard," she said gently. He shuffled inside, wringing his cap between his hands. I didn't mean any harm," he blurted before she could speak. "It was just a prank, a harmless thing." Miss Marple guided him to a chair. "No harm," she said mildly. Terrifying a woman interfering for her life, humiliating her before the entire village. Harold's face crumpled. "She made a fool of me," he burst out, "always ordering me about, correcting my flower arrangements, laughing behind my back. I just wanted to frighten her, teach her a lesson." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "And so you made the doll?" He nodded miserably. "Used some old wax candles, took scraps from the jumble sale. I thought it would make her think twice. And the cufflinks," he flushed. "I didn't realize I'd lost them. They must have fallen when I put the doll there." Miss Marple regarded him sadly. "And when you heard about the investigation?" "I panicked," he whispered. "Tried to break in, burn the records, anything to stop them finding the cufflink. And Maria Lopez, I never meant for her to be blamed," he cried. "I swear it." Miss Marple sighed. "I believe you," she said softly, "but you must set it right." Harold buried his face in his hands. "I will," he said. "I will." Thus the stage was set. The next day, at morning service, Harold Pritchard stood trembling before the assembled congregation and confessed everything. The doll, the fear, the folly, the villagers, stunned into silence, listened as the truth peeled away the comfortable myths they had wrapped themselves in. Maria Lopez was exonerated publicly, and her shy, grateful smile as the vicar proclaimed her innocence brought tears to more than one eye. Fernwood Hollow, bruised but wiser, began its slow healing. And Miss Marple, slipping quietly out of the church into the misty lane beyond, reflected, as she so often did, on the endless complicated marvel of human nature. Because in every village, beneath every polished pew and whitewashed wall, old grievances simmered, and sometimes it took no more than a wax doll and a few careless pins to bring them boiling to the surface. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The village of Fernwood Hollow, relieved yet chastened after Harold Pritchard's confession, tried very hard to return to normal. The Harvest Festival Committee resumed its planning with subdued enthusiasm. Mrs. Littleton, though still pale, resumed her duties at the vicarage with renewed dignity, grateful for the quiet apologies that filtered her way. Even young Maria Lopez, once regarded with fearful suspicion, now found herself inundated with awkward gifts of preserves and knitted scarves. It might have been the end of the matter, indeed for most of Fernwood Hollow it was, but not for Miss Marple. Because in the midst of the village's sigh of relief, she had noticed something curious, something that did not quite fit, and Miss Marple knew better than most that when even the smallest thread is left untied, the whole fabric can still unravel. It was 2 days after Harold's confession when the clue revealed itself. Miss Marple had gone to the church once again, not out of morbid curiosity, but to quietly supervise the reshelving of hymnals, a duty that had fallen to Mrs. Weatherby, who had immediately pressed Miss Marple into service under the excuse of her superior sense of order. As she knelt to stack the worn volumes beneath the Lady Chapel, Miss Marple's hand brushed something small and hard beneath the wooden pews. She picked it up. It was a tiny button, no larger than the tip of her little finger, covered in faded blue silk. It would have been unremarkable, except for 2 things. First, it did not match the simple homespun clothes Harold Pritchard had used to create his crude wax figure. Second, the fabric was unmistakably part of the vicar's wife's real Sunday hat. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. If the button had come from Mrs. Littleton's actual clothing, how had it ended up under the pew? And more importantly, when? She sat quietly on the nearest bench, thinking. Harold had confessed to making a doll, a cruel but amateurish thing, assembled from scraps gathered at the jumble sale. He had admitted to using scraps resembling Mrs. Littleton's clothing, but never her actual possessions. He had even insisted rather tearfully that he would never touch her real clothes, which meant the presence of the button indicated something else entirely. Someone else had been involved, someone who had access to Mrs. Littleton's belongings. Someone who had perhaps made the wax figure even more personal, more vicious than Harold had ever intended. Miss Marple tucked the button carefully into her reticule. She felt a familiar thrill, that curious mixture of dread and satisfaction, that came whenever a mystery deepened rather than resolved. The village thought the matter closed, but she knew better. The real danger, she suspected, was yet to be revealed. That afternoon Miss Marple paid a quiet call at the vicarage. Mrs. Littleton, still fragile but recovering, welcomed her into the sunny sitting-room. "Miss Marple," she said warmly, though her hands still fluttered nervously over the tea tray. "You've been so good to us through all this wretched business." Miss Marple smiled. "I find tea and good company cure many things, Mrs. Littleton." As they sipped their tea, Miss Marple broached the topic delicately. "My dear," she said, "I wonder if you have noticed anything missing? Any small item, of clothing perhaps? A glove, a scarf, a hat?" Mrs. Littleton frowned, setting down her cup. "Well, now you mention it, I did misplace a hat not long ago. My blue Sunday hat. I thought perhaps it had been crushed in the jumble donations." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled gently. "Crushed or stolen?" Mrs. Littleton looked startled. "Surely not. Who would want an old hat?" "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "Who, indeed?" Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. Someone had stolen Mrs. Littleton's hat. Someone had taken real pieces of her clothing to make the wax doll more convincingly cruel. Harold Pritchard, for all his foolishness, lacked both the malice and the nerve for such a calculated act. He had been used, manipulated, and the real architect of the cruelty remained hidden. Miss Marple considered the possibilities. Maria Lopez was no longer in her mind, nor were the Cartwrights or other newcomers. No, the true culprit had to be someone familiar with both the church and the vicarage, someone trusted, someone overlooked. She thought again of the old quarrels she had heard whispered during afternoon teas, of small, hidden envies, of resentments allowed to curdle into something darker, and suddenly she knew exactly where to look next. The following morning, Miss Marple attended the Women's Guild meeting at the parish hall, ostensibly to discuss the rescheduling of the Harvest Festival. The usual crowd was gathered: Mrs. Weatherby, Mrs. Danvers, Mrs. Sims, all bustling with self-importance. And seated quietly near the back, pretending to be absorbed in her knitting, was Miss Elsie Carter, the vicar's housekeeper. Miss Marple watched her carefully. Elsie Carter had served at the vicarage for nearly 20 years. Faithful, discreet, invisible. Exactly the sort of person no one ever suspected. Exactly the sort of person who might nurse a grudge for years without ever revealing it. And Miss Marple, who had once heard a whispered story about Mrs. Littleton demoting Elsie from housekeeper to domestic help after a single imagined slight, knew how deeply such wounds could fester. After the meeting, Miss Marple approached her gently. "My dear Miss Carter," she said kindly, "such a comfort you must be to Mrs. Littleton in these difficult times." Elsie smiled tightly. "Just doing my duty, Miss Marple. And no doubt it was you who packed away the jumble donations. Such a tedious task." Elsie's hands tightened on her knitting. "Yes," she said shortly. "And you would have had access to Mrs. Littleton's closet?" A flicker of something, fear, crossed her face. Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "One must be very careful with old things. Sentiment, you know. So easy to lose track." Elsie mumbled something inaudible and hurried away. Miss Marple watched her go, her suspicions confirmed. The wax doll was not born from Harold's simple resentment alone. It had been crafted, shaped by someone with knowledge, with motive, and with a deeper, colder anger, and very soon Miss Marple would see that truth revealed fully. Because in villages like Fernwood Hollow, The past never stayed buried, not even under wax and pins. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The village of Fernwood Hollow, though outwardly calmer since Harold Pritchard's confession, still simmered with unease beneath its surface. Suspicion, once stirred, was not so easily stilled, and the gossip that had once been harmless entertainment now carried a sharper, more dangerous edge. It was not merely the question of the wax doll that disturbed Miss Marple. It was the undercurrents she sensed, resentments long buried, old grievances finding new breath. And as she watched the villagers move about their daily routines, she recognized the signs. There was to be a reckoning, and it would not be gentle. The next confrontation came sooner than expected. It happened in the tea-room, of all places, where Mrs. Danvers and Mrs. Weatherby had gathered after church, there, heads close together over seed cake and gossip. The conversation, which had begun innocuously enough with complaints about the weather, quickly soured. "I still say," Mrs. Danvers announced loudly, "that we haven't rooted out all the troublemakers yet." Mrs. Weatherby looked affronted. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" Mrs. Danvers leaned closer, lowering her voice only slightly. "I mean," she said, "that some people know more than they're saying. Some people who've been inside the vicarage." Several heads turned. Mrs. Weatherby bristled. "If you're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Mrs. Danvers said with poisonous sweetness. "But it seems odd, doesn't it, that someone so close to the family wouldn't have noticed a missing hat?" A flush crept up Mrs. Weatherby's neck. Miss Marple, sipping her tea silently in the corner, watched with clinical interest. Confrontations, when they occurred naturally, often revealed more than direct questioning ever could. And sure enough, as the argument spiraled, other voices joined in. Old grudges were resurrected. Petty slights, imagined insults, minor scandals from decades past. It was as though the wax doll had torn away a polite veneer, leaving raw nerves exposed to the air. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple strolled toward the vicarage under the pretence of delivering some needlework for the church bazaar. She found Mrs. Littleton in the sitting room, pale but determined, sorting through parish records. "It's such unpleasantness," Mrs. Littleton murmured, when Miss Marple delicately broached the topic of the tea-room quarrel. "I had hoped, after Harold's confession, that it would all be behind us." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Fear," she said, "is a powerful thing, my dear. Once it takes root, it grows in directions we seldom expect." Mrs. Littleton sighed, massaging her temples. "I trust we've seen the end of it." Miss Marple smiled kindly, but said nothing. She doubted the village had seen the end of anything. Not yet. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fireside, knitting, untouched in her lap. The tiny silk button from Mrs. Littleton's real hat lay on the table beside her, along with the second cufflink she had found in the vestry. 2 small items, insignificant on their own, but together they told a story of anger, a story of manipulation. And Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime unravelling such human tangles, knew she was close now, very close. The next morning dawned misty and cool, the first true breath of autumn in the air. Miss Marple dressed with care, her plain blue dress, her sensible walking shoes. and set out for the vicarage once more. She had an appointment with Miss Elsie Carter. Officially, it was to discuss arrangements for the bazaar's tea tent. Unofficially, it was to gently, subtly push at the cracks in Elsie Carter's carefully constructed facade. Miss Marple was not one for direct confrontation. She preferred traps made of words and silences, of glances, of careful, innocent-seeming questions, and most importantly, of letting the guilty reveal themselves. She found Elsie in the vicarage kitchen, polishing the silver with brisk efficiency. "Good morning, Miss Carter," Miss Marple said brightly. "May I steal a moment of your time?" Elsie wiped her hands and gestured stiffly toward a chair. Miss Marple sat, setting her knitting bag neatly beside her. "I couldn't help but admire the organization of the tea tent preparations," she said. "Such careful attention to detail." Elsie gave a tight smile. "Someone has to keep things running," she said. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "and such an eye for small things. Why, I imagine you could spot a missing button from across a crowded room." Elsie stiffened slightly. Miss Marple continued, her voice light. "I've always admired those who notice what others overlook. For instance, recognizing a scrap of real clothing amidst jumble sale odds and ends." Elsie said nothing. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "I imagine it would be easy," she said softly, "for someone with access to the vicarage wardrobes to borrow a small item, just for a little while." Still silence, and imagine how convincing the wax doll would seem, Miss Marple said, her voice a mere whisper now. "If it carried something real, something unmistakably personal." Elsie's hands tightened on the silver cloth. "You have no proof," she said hoarsely. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Proof is not always necessary, Miss Carter. In villages like ours, confession comes quicker than one thinks. Sometimes all it takes is a kind word at the right moment, a little forgiveness, perhaps." Elsie's face crumpled. "I didn't mean to hurt her," she cried. "I just wanted her to be frightened, to know what it felt like to be powerless. After all the times she humiliated me, dismissed me before the others, made me feel so small." Tears spilled over her cheeks. Miss Marple said nothing, letting the confession flow. "I didn't tell Harold to make the doll," Elsie sobbed. "But once he did, I made it worse. I added the real pieces. I made sure it would terrify her." "And when Harold confessed," Miss Marple asked gently. "I thought it was over," Elsie whispered. "I thought no one would look deeper." Miss Marple patted her hand kindly. "Fear makes fools of us all," she said. "But confession can sometimes set us free." That evening, Miss Marple sat once again by her fire, the autumn mist pressing against the cottage windows. The truth had been coaxed from its hiding place, not through threats or accusations, but through patience, through understanding the fragile, often wounded hearts of human beings. In the end, it was not witchcraft or evil that had created the wax doll. It was loneliness, pride, the small cruelties that festered over time, and it was those same fragile human hearts, Miss Marple thought, that deserved kindness even after justice was done. She picked up her knitting and resumed her work. Outside, Fernwood Hollow slept fitfully under the rising mist. And within the quiet heart of the village truth, painful, healing, had finally found its voice. Chapter 7. Another Twist. For a brief golden span of days, it seemed as though peace might return to Fernwood Hollow. The autumn leaves burned crimson and gold along the hedgerows. Children's laughter floated over the village green. Preparations for the harvest festival resumed in earnest, with Mrs. Weatherby overseeing every detail with military precision. The wax doll affair, while still whispered about over tea and shopping baskets, began to recede into the mist of village memory, filed away alongside tales of floods, bad harvests and scandalous elopements. Even Elsie Carter, after her confession, found a kind of uneasy forgiveness among the villagers. She remained at the vicarage, her work dutiful and her demeanour subdued, and though eyes followed her more carefully now, there was a quiet, tacit agreement to let the matter rest. And yet Miss Marple was not at ease, not entirely, because she had learned through long and sometimes painful experience that true peace did not come from burying truth. And there was something, some small, stubborn inconsistency, that would not settle in her mind. The twist came on a blustery Friday afternoon. Miss Marple was on her way back from Mrs. Danvers's cottage, having delivered a basket of jam jars for the upcoming fete, when she spotted Reverend Greenway pacing in front of the vicarage, his brow furrowed and his hands twisting nervously. She paused at the gate. "Good afternoon, Reverend. A fine day for a walk." He looked up, startled, as though seeing her for the first time. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight with strain. I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment." "Of course," she said at once, and followed him inside. In the vicarage study, he gestured wordlessly to a battered envelope resting on his desk. "I received this by post," he said. Miss Marple picked it up. There was no return address. The paper was cheap and rough. The ink faded, as though the pen had run dry. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, in clumsy block letters, were the words, "The wax doll was only the beginning. There will be another." Beneath the warning was a crude drawing. A figure, indistinct, almost childlike, lying prone under a great stone cross. Miss Marple's heart gave a quiet thud. She laid the paper down carefully. "When did this arrive?" she asked. "This morning, along with the parish bulletins." "And you've told no one?" He shook his head. "I didn't want to alarm anyone, not after—" "Well, everything." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "This wasn't written by Elsie Carter," she said. The Reverend looked startled. "But surely—" "No," Miss Marple said firmly. "Elsie acted out of personal hurt, personal spite. This—" She tapped the paper lightly. "This is cold, detached, calculated." She paused. "And if I'm not mistaken, it is a threat not against Mrs. Littleton this time, but against you, Reverend." For a long moment there was silence. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. Finally, Reverend Greenway said, "Who would wish me harm?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "I do not know yet," she said, "but I intend to find out, because one thing was certain now. The affair of the wax doll had been only the surface disturbance. The real danger, the true rot, ran deeper. Someone in Fernwood Hollow was nursing a grudge black enough to turn to threats. And if Miss Marple had learned anything over her long years, it was that such grudges, left unchecked, often found their final expression in violence. That evening, as mist crept low over the village, Miss Marple gathered her thoughts by her fireside. She laid out the facts methodically. Harold Pritchard had been guilty, but only of a clumsy, vengeful prank. Elsie Carter had deepened the cruelty, but acted out of long-simmering hurt. Yet someone else remained in the shadows, someone with colder blood and a longer plan. The crude drawing haunted her. A figure under a great stone cross, symbolic, literal. Fernwood Hollow's churchyard was ancient, its headstones crumbling, its yew trees gnarled with age. It would not be difficult, Miss Marple thought grimly, for a determined hand to turn a symbol into a scene. The next morning she rose early and walked to the churchyard. Mist curled low among the graves. The great stone crosses loomed out of the fog like silent sentinels. She moved slowly, carefully, noting every overturned leaf, every broken twig, and there, near the oldest part of the churchyard, she found it, fresh earth, disturbed a grave, not newly dug, but recently tampered with. She knelt carefully. The name on the headstone was worn by time. Thomas Littleton, Mrs. Littleton's first husband, who had died under tragic circumstances 15 years ago. Miss Marple remembered now. Whispers of a fall from a horse, a funeral that had felt a little too rushed, a few lingering doubts never voiced aloud. And now someone had disturbed his resting place. She straightened slowly, her mind whirring. The doll, the button, the anonymous threat. It was all connected, but not simply to Mrs. Littleton. No, the roots of this mystery went back further, to the Littletons themselves, to a past sin not yet fully atoned for. As she returned to Rose Cottage, her steps brisk despite her age, Miss Marple knew that the danger had not passed. It had only grown sharper, more personal. And unless she could untangle the true motive behind the wax doll and the new threat, someone else might soon pay the price for secrets buried but not forgotten. The village thought it knew the worst, but Fernwood Hollow, like so many quiet English villages, hid a darkness that even Miss Marple sometimes hesitated to touch. Still, she would touch it. She would pull it into the light. Before it was too late. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test. Miss Marple rose early the next day, her mind already settled on what needed to be done. The threat to Reverend Greenway could not be ignored, nor the disturbed grave of Thomas Littleton left unexplored. Somewhere, in Fernwood Hollow, someone nursed a grievance so poisonous it had survived not just months but years, hidden under smiles and polite tea conversations. She needed to act, but delicately. In Fernwood Hollow, the truth could not be forced. It had to be coaxed out, like a wary cat from under a hedge. And so Miss Marple decided to set her trap, quietly, publicly, and with the entire village as her unwitting audience. That morning, she made 2 careful visits. First, she stopped by the vicarage and asked Reverend Greenway for a small favour. He agreed, though he looked puzzled and a little concerned. Then she visited the church notice board. There, among announcements for choir practice and sewing circles, Miss Marple pinned a new notice, handwritten in her neatest, most unthreatening script. Special service, a memorial blessing at St. Winifred's Church, Sunday next, 5 p.m. In loving remembrance of Thomas Littleton, beloved husband and parishioner. All welcome. It was a bold move. She knew it would stir old gossip. Whispers about Mrs. Littleton's first marriage. Questions about why now, after 15 years. That was the point. If the real culprit was watching, and Miss Marple was quite certain they were, this public reminder of buried secrets would be too much to ignore. By Saturday evening, the village was in a ferment. Harvest festival plans were forgotten. Instead, tea rooms and back gardens hummed with speculation. "Strange, isn't it?" Mrs. Sims whispered to Mrs. Danvers. "A service after all these years." "I always said there was something odd about Thomas Littleton's death," Mrs. Danvers replied, lowering her voice. "Do you suppose—" "Well," Mrs. Danvers said archly, "accidents happen. But sometimes accidents have a helping hand, don't they?" Miss Marple listened quietly from a nearby table, her knitting needles flashing. The bait was set. All that remained was to see who would bite. Sunday arrived with heavy clouds and a steady, insistent drizzle. Perfect weather, Miss Marple thought, for stirring old ghosts. She attended the morning service, noted the unusually large congregation, and returned home to rest and prepare for the evening. At precisely 5 o'clock, she made her way to St. Winifred's. The church was already half full, Nishitbur, an impressive turnout given the short notice and the weather. Faces both familiar and wary turned toward the entrance as Miss Marple slipped into her usual pew. Mrs. Littleton sat near the front, her face pale but composed. Reverend Greenway took his place at the pulpit, clearing his throat nervously. Miss Marple watched the villagers carefully, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Harold Pritchard, Elsie Carter, Mrs. Danvers, Mrs. Weatherby, and near the back, a figure she had half hoped, half feared to see. Mr. Felix Turner, a name seldom spoken these days, Thomas Littleton's cousin, an infrequent visitor to the village, always lingering on the edges of events, neither fully absent nor fully present. And now here he was, hunched in the shadows, his eyes fixed not on the pulpit, but on Mrs. Littleton. Miss Marple's heart gave a tiny, satisfied thud. There, she thought, was her answer. The service began, solemn and brief. Reverend Greenway spoke of forgiveness, of remembrance, of the healing power of truth. Miss Marple barely heard the words. She was watching Turner, noting the way his hands twisted the brim of his hat, the way his eyes darted, not with sorrow or reverence, but with anger, with calculation. When the service ended, Reverend Greenway invited the congregation to join him outside, where a wreath would be laid by Thomas Littleton's grave. The villagers, murmuring, filed into the misty churchyard. Miss Marple made sure to walk slowly, to give Turner time to act. And sure enough, as they reached the graves, she saw it, a sudden movement, a quick bend toward the earth. And when Turner straightened, a small bundle of twigs and black ribbon, a crude charm, lay at the base of the stone. Several villagers gasped. Mrs. Littleton staggered and would have fallen if Reverend Greenway had not caught her arm. Miss Marple stepped forward calmly. "Mr. Turner," she said pleasantly. "How thoughtful of you to leave a tribute." Turner paled. I didn't know." Miss Marple's voice was still mild. "And yet I saw you place it, just as I saw you at the post office the morning the threatening letter arrived." He opened his mouth and closed it again. Around them, the villagers pressed closer, a growing murmur of suspicion and realization. Miss Marple turned to the vicar. "I believe," she said, "that Mr. Turner had something to confess." And so, under the grey dripping sky, the final truth came out. Felix Turner had long resented Thomas Littleton for family money withheld, for perceived slights, for marrying the woman Turner himself had once quietly adored. When Thomas died, Turner had suspected, though never proven, that Mrs. Littleton bore some indirect blame, and he had hated her for it ever since. The wax doll, the threats, the disturbed grave, all were his doing, a long, slow vengeance fueled by bitterness and jealousy, disguised under layers of gossip and fear. Harold Pritchard had been an unwitting pawn, Elsie Carter a convenient distraction, but the true architect of the village's terror was Turner. That night, as the villagers dispersed in stunned silence and Turner was taken into custody, Miss Marple sat once more by her fireside. The rain pattered gently against the windows. Her knitting lay in her lap, forgotten for now. The mystery of the wax doll had been solved. The deeper, darker story had been laid bare. And Fernwood Hollow, though wounded, would heal, as villages always did, slowly, stubbornly, in spite of themselves. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Human nature, she thought, was a curious thing, capable of great cruelty and greater resilience. She picked up her knitting needles once more and resumed her quiet, steady work. Outside, the mist rolled away from the green fields. Inside, in the warm heart of the village, truth and healing, slow, imperfect, but real, began their quiet work. Chapter 9. The Reveal. The villagers of Fernwood Hollow gathered once more in St. Winifred's Parish Hall the following evening, summoned by Reverend Greenway for what was diplomatically termed a community reflection. But there was no mistaking the undercurrent of tension as chairs scraped against the floor and whispered speculations buzzed through the cold autumn air. Everyone knew why they were there. Everyone wanted answers, and it was Miss Marple, quietly seated by the fireplace near her customary plain blue dress, who would provide them. She rose slowly when Reverend Greenway cleared his throat and gestured toward her, the murmur in the room falling to an eager hush. Miss Marple clasped her hands gently before her and began, her voice soft but unwavering. "This has been," she said, "a most unfortunate chapter in our village's life. Fear has run ahead of reason. Gossip has clouded judgment, and innocent people have suffered needlessly." A few villagers shifted uncomfortably. She smiled kindly, easing the sting. "But now, I believe, the truth must be plainly laid before you all, so that healing can begin." She paused, surveying the sea of anxious faces. "Let us start," she said, "with the wax doll." A few gasps rippled through the room. Harold Pritchard, in a moment of wounded pride and foolishness, crafted a crude wax figure dressed to resemble Mrs. Littleton. His motive, though wrong, was very human, a desire to frighten, not to harm. Harold, seated near the door, blushed, crimson, but did not protest. However, Miss Marple continued, the figure was later altered, enhanced, made far more personal and vicious. She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small, carefully wrapped item, the blue silk button she had found. This button, she said, holding it up, came from Mrs. Littleton's real Sunday hat, stolen from her wardrobe by someone who had regular access to the vicarage. All eyes turned instinctively to Elsie Carter, who sat rigidly, pale but composed. Elsie rose shakily. I admitted it, she said. I helped make the doll worse. I was hurt and angry, but I swear, I didn't write those threats. I didn't disturb the grave. Miss Marple inclined her head. I believe you, Miss Carter. There was a collective exhale in the room. But, she said, and here her voice sharpened slightly, there was another hand at work, a colder hand, one not driven by wounded feelings, but by long-standing hatred. The hall seemed to hold its breath. That hand, Miss Marple said, turning toward the gathered villagers, belonged to Mr. Felix Turner. Gasps erupted. Turner, seated, stiffly near the back, half rose from his chair, his face mottled with fury. "It's a lie!" he cried, but Miss Marple only looked at him with infinite calm. "You tampered with Thomas Littleton's grave," she said. "You sent the anonymous threat to the vicar. You intended to push Mrs. Littleton and the entire village into a state of fear and suspicion." She folded her hands again. "And why? Because you resented Thomas Littleton's success, his marriage, his life here in Fernwood Hollow. You believed Mrs. Littleton contributed to his death, though you had no proof. So you sought revenge, not through direct violence, but through terror." Turner's hands curled into fists. "You have no evidence," he spat. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "On the contrary, I observed you placing the crude charm at Thomas Littleton's grave during the memorial service, when you thought no one was watching. I also know you were seen at the post office the morning the threatening letter arrived. Your handwriting, altered though it was, bears distinctive characteristics. A fractured R and a looping T, common to people who learned penmanship in certain London schools at the turn of the century." She paused delicately. "And of course there is the matter of motive, the strongest evidence of all." Turner sagged back into his seat, defeated. The room buzzed with disbelief and dark satisfaction. Miss Marple continued gently. "We must not allow ourselves to be consumed by anger," she said. "Mr. Turner's actions were wrong, deeply wrong, but they grew from a human place. Pain, resentment, grief." She looked around the room. "We are all vulnerable to such things. It is only when we let them rule us that we become dangerous." There was a long, thoughtful silence. Then Reverend Greenway rose and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Miss Marple," he said simply. And the villagers, after a heartbeat of hesitation, broke into quiet, respectful applause. The meeting dispersed slowly, people speaking in hushed tones as they slipped out into the misty evening. Miss Marple lingered behind, gathering her knitting and shawl. As she stepped into the cold air, she paused by the churchyard wall. The mist curled low over the stones, softening the sharp outlines of the graves. Life in Fernwood Hollow would go on. Scandals would fade, the harvest festival would be held. A little more sombre, perhaps, but no less earnest. New gossip would rise, old quarrels would heal or at least be forgotten. Such was the way of villages. And beneath it all, the quiet knowledge that even in the most peaceful places, the currents of human nature ran deep, and dark, and endlessly fascinating. Miss Marple smiled to herself and pulled her shawl tighter. She had no illusions about human perfection, but she had faith in human endurance. And that, she thought, was quite enough. Chapter 10. Aftermathin. The days that followed the final gathering at the parish hall, Fernwood Hollow slowly, stubbornly, began to knit itself back together. The harvest festival proceeded as planned, albeit with a quieter, more reflective tone. The cakes were still judged, the prize marrow awarded, and the children still raced in their sack races across the damp green. But the laughter was softer, the smiles tinged with a shared, unspoken memory of what had nearly torn them apart. Felix Turner was quietly taken away to Milchester to await trial. The official charges were limited: disturbing a grave, sending threatening communications. But in the court of village opinion, he had been judged for something much greater: the deliberate poisoning of a community's trust. Mrs. Littleton, after much urging from Reverend Greenway and the Dr. Masterson, agreed to take a short holiday to Bath to recover her nerves. Emily Carter, relieved of suspicion and now something of a local heroine for her discovery, helped organize a fundraising raffle for the church roof, and was often seen chatting animatedly with the Cartwright twins. As for Harold Pritchard, he remained verger of St. Winifred's, though he carried himself more humbly now, his once proud figure a little bowed under the weight of public forgiveness. Miss Marple had spoken quietly to Reverend Greenway about mercy, and the vicar had agreed. Harold had erred out of folly, not malice. Even Elsie Carter, whose betrayal of trust might once have condemned her to exile, found a kind of uneasy acceptance. Villagers, after all, understood resentment. Most had carried a petty grievance or two in their time, and her quiet, uncomplaining work spoke louder than any apologies could. Miss Marple herself found little change to her quiet life at Rose Cottage, though there were more frequent invitations to tea than usual, and several embarrassed attempts by villagers to thank her more formally, all of which she declined with gentle amusement. She was not one for public acclaim. It was enough to know the village was healing. It was enough to sit once more by her cosy fireside, knitting in her lap, the evening wind rattling at the window panes, and to think, always to think. On a crisp Thursday afternoon, Mrs. Weatherby paid a call, bustling into Rose Cottage with a basket of scones and 1,000 questions she was too polite to voice directly. Miss Marple served tea and listened patiently as Mrs. Weatherby worked her way around to the heart of the matter. "I suppose," Mrs. Weatherby said at last, buttering a scone, "that it all makes sense now, in a way. But really, Miss Marple, how ever did you know? How did you see what none of the rest of us could?" Miss Marple smiled, setting down her cup. "My dear," she said, "it was all quite ordinary, really. Human nature seldom surprises me any more." She ticked off the points neatly, as if reciting a simple recipe. First, the wax doll was far too cruel, too personal, for Harold Pritchard's simple mischief alone. That suggested a second hand. Then the silk button from Mrs. Littleton's real hat indicated access to her personal belongings, pointing to someone inside the vicarage. And yet, she continued, even Elsie Carter's confession lacked the cold malice required for the threatening letter and the grave disturbance. Mrs. Weatherby nodded, her eyes wide. And so, Miss Marple finished, I considered who else might harbour an older, deeper resentment. Someone outside the immediate household. Someone who had long envied or hated quietly. She smiled gently. In villages like ours, it is never the newcomers one need fear. It is the old faces, the ones who remembered too much. Mrs. Weatherby gave a little shiver. Quite chilling when you think of it. Miss Marple's smile deepened. Not chilling, my dear, only very, very human. As autumn deepened into early winter, Fernwood Hollow settled once more into its familiar rhythms. There were harvest suppers and choir rehearsals, cold blue mornings and smoky golden evenings. New gossip replaced the old. Mr. Pierce's scandalous new motor car, Mrs. Simms's running battle with a flock of unruly geese, speculation about who might replace Mrs. Littleton on the flower committee. While she was away, life, as it always did, went on. Yet beneath the surface, something had changed, subtly but irrevocably. The villagers had looked into the shadowy corners of their own hearts and seen what lurked there. Resentment, jealousy, fear, and perhaps, just perhaps, they had learned something from it. They were a little kinder now, a little slower to judge, a little more willing to forgive. One evening, as the first frost silvered the village lanes, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her cat curled contentedly at her feet. She thought of Felix Turner, and of all the other men and women she had encountered over the years who had let bitterness consume them. She thought, too, of Harold Pritchard's shame, Elsie Carter's sorrow, Mrs. Littleton's pride. All different stories, yet all cut from the same human cloth. It was a comforting thought in a way. Flaws could lead to cruelty, but they could also lead to healing, to change, to quiet, stubborn goodness. Miss Marple picked up her knitting needles and resumed her steady work, her hands sure, her mind clear. Outside, the church bells tolled across the fields, their sound soft and steady against the gathering dusk. And inside, in the warm glow of Rose Cottage, Miss Marple smiled to herself and thought, all is well for now, all is well.